Hey there, folks, and welcome to another episode of Crit Hit Interviews. I'm Arlyeon, and we're here today with Joey Bougneit. Did I say that right?
No, it's Bougneit.
Bougneit. Joey Bougneit. God damn it. Go figure that the easier name than some of the other ones that I've said is the one I completely fuck up.
It's extremely weird. Everybody, I've only had like two people in my entire life pronounce it correctly on the first try, so it's not a
Bougneit.
problem.
There we go. For those not familiar, he's the developer of the Pitch Black Dungeon mod, which, you may be familiar with if you're a player of Darkest Dungeon. Normally when we kick off our interviews, we specifically ask a lot of questions, just sort of geared to familiarize people with you and a bit of your background. So starting with the fun questions, what's your favorite game?
I'll just say that my favorite game is The Last of Us. I'm a huge fan of story-driven games, games that really have an emotional impact and push the envelope of interactive storytelling.
I'm a filthy heathen and haven't played or watched a Let's Play of that game.
Really?
I don't, like, I mean, I have a PS3. I can't recall if there is anything on PS3 for it.
Yeah, that's what it originally came out on.
Whoops. Wow, my
Yeah,
excuse for not
it's a
playing
pretty
it
big
just
whoops.
went out the window. I mean, I'm barely console game. The last I did for recent titles was Drakengard 3, and that was it. I just, yeah. Still,
You're definitely missing out on some good games.
I know, okay, I know. There's so many indie games I need to play, and I do not have enough clones of myself.
It's true.
Hands.
There's so many games that are coming out these days.
Like, almost on a daily basis at times.
Yeah.
It's great, actually, to be an indie
It's
gamer.
good for having things to do, but it's bad when there are, 2 to 3 games that come out in the same week.
Yeah, there's some actually great high quality titles too, though. Like, I keep being told by a coworker slash friend, you should go play Hollow Knight. I get that like almost every week of like, have you played it yet? And me just being like, no.
I'm actually in the same basket as you. I've heard great things about that, but I've never played it.
Which leads into, so what have you been recently playing?
Oh man, well, I've been playing some guilty pleasure procrastination titles like Warframe and Path of Exile. But I played the new God of War. That was absolutely fantastic. And I played the new Far Cry a little bit. Still need to finish it. It's very enjoyable. I don't think much else though. Just procrastinating too much for my work and telling people that I'm working when I'm actually playing.
Fair enough. So on the subject of working, what actually got you into game development?
Well, my dad was big into computers back in the 90s and what. I mean, he was always big into computers as a kid too. But he introduced my brother and I to computer games and Sega Genesis pretty early on in our lives. And I always enjoyed games, probably a bit too much as a kid. Um, I could tell you a lot of stories about how I got in trouble with video games as a kid. Um, but I was really intrigued by RPG games like Ultima, and Might and Magic, and Heroes of Might and Magic. And I really wanted to get into making video games, but it's something as a kid that always kind of seems out of reach. Like, oh, I want to make games, but nobody ever knows how. It's not like you can go up to an adult when you were born, for me in the 90s, and ask, how do you make video games? Nobody's gonna know how. So it always seemed far-fetched, but it was when my brother and I got a PS3 our for Christmas one year, and the first game that I got was Uncharted 1, and I played that, and it drew me in so much that I said right there when I was, I think, like in middle school when that came out. I think it was like 2009 or 2000. It was somewhere around that. And I said I wanted to go into game development for sure, and I wanted to be a game designer. So it was Naughty Dog that really got me into that and showed me that intriguing, story-driven games could be successful.
Fair enough. On a certain level, I sort of want to compare notes on those childhood stories of getting in trouble over video games, but instead, what sort of skills has game development required you to put to use? And where exactly did you develop them?
It required me to change a lot about myself. It was more than I ever thought I would have to undertake to be in an industry like this. I never knew it was this competitive. I have not attended college for any sort of for anything, so everything that I've learned, it's been self-taught, and it's been very difficult, but it's been very fun, very challenging, and I think that's ultimately what I love as part of the job, is that there's always something new, there's always something challenging. You know, you can do the same kind of work on two different games, but ultimately it's two completely different titles. So I really enjoy the fact that the future of my career has, you know, hopefully over 10 titles that I want to work on, and they're all going to give me different opportunities and different things to look forward to. I guess I kind of glanced over the whole skill part of that question. I know that I'm very introverted, so it's been quite a journey to help open myself up. Not to get rid of the introversion, but just to make myself better to communicate, which is always something I've struggled with. And a lot of the computer skills I didn't have much of. I mean, I was always great with computers, but it's just I never messed around with stuff like spreadsheets as a kid, so getting into that's been very enjoyable, and I was very done with programming as a kid, so I've been expanding into those skills as well. It's a lot of new stuff. It's a lot of new challenges, and I love it.
Fair enough. So, one thing that I find very interesting is you started out working on a mod, but you eventually were contracted by the folks at Red Hook Studio, like the Darkest Dungeon devs themselves. So how did that come to happen?
Well, I started working on two mods. Darkest Dungeon's first mod was my first mod, and that was Lighter Dungeon. And then 2 days later, I released Pitch Black Dungeon. I made both of these to cater to forum users who expressed their discontent with the current balance. And it wasn't me trying to make the game better, but more just there were some people who wanted it easier and some people wanted it harder. And I thought, all right, well, maybe just, you know, maybe these files are editable somehow. Maybe I could mod. It turned out you could, and I just kept track of my changes and released it, acted professional. I was looking for an opportunity to display my skills that I had obtained so far and the theoretical skills that I had learned from, you know, years and years of playing and studying games to become a designer. And I contacted Tyler, the co-creator and lead designer of Darkest Dungeon, at that time to ask about the legality of modding, because some developers aren't cool with the modding of their content. He was very cool with it. And I even asked for if there was any work that I could do officially at that time, and he turned me down. But he told me not to be discouraged, and that in the future opportunities may present themselves if I work hard enough. And I took that seriously. So I sat down and I focused pretty heavily on developing both of my, or all of my mods at that time. I had, I think, 3 at that time. And especially with Pitch Black Dungeon, it was kind of my baby. I took care of it and I developed it with a lot of new ideas. And I would say it was a few months after I've released PVD 4.0, which was the big overhaul update for PVD, that Chris and Tyler contacted me and wanted to talk about potential opportunities.
So, what was it like working with them?
It was really fantastic. It was very new for me. It was a little scary. It was definitely something I wanted, but it was also, these were professionals. These were people with, over a decade of experience. So it was just kind of, there was so much to learn from them and so much to learn about how professionals created a game. Because up to that point, I just had theoretical knowledge of what needed to be done to make a game and personal experience with modding, which I would say modding, if you work on something as large as an overhaul, is difficult in its own way. But working on an actual game, an actual live product, is in many ways extremely different. So working with them was great. They're very, very nice people, very professional, and they were very understanding of my amateur skills and lack of knowledge.
So, you already touched on this a little bit when you were referencing how it was your baby, but what was it specifically that led to not only the creation of, but also the elaboration of the Pitch Black Dungeon mod?
When I started, I was in the camp that Darkest Dungeon was a little bit too easy. So I kind of gravitated towards making it more difficult normally, but difficult in a more fair way. And I would say that PVD did not start off that way. It was quite I wouldn't say, well, it was poorly thought out, and it was at most a light rebalance initially. But it changed with 4.0 in the fact that I had an idea in the shower, which is, I think, the best place to have ideas, that hero skills at level 3 and 5 could get upgrades, could get changes that would change how they work or give them new buffs, kind of ways to jump on top of, to add on to the idea of just simple stat upgrades. Another grade I upgraded, and now I have 3% more accuracy. So it was this idea that hero skills got stronger and changed the way that your heroes interacted with each other and the way that new synergies opened up. But it was also, I counterbalanced this with the idea of affixes, which I took from one of my other mods, which was Twisted Dungeon at that time. And that later got molded into PVD because Twisted Dungeon downloads were extremely small. So I had these mini bosses in Twisted Dungeon that I thought, again, in the shower, I could use the same concept of creating new files, new actual enemies, but just treating them in the game as the same. Tricking players into thinking that they're new enemies within the file, or tricking players into thinking that they're affixes when they're actually new enemies. So I then took a look at games like Path of Exile and Diablo and other games with similar systems, and I kind of created the initial set of, I think maybe it was like 20 or 25 affixes.
Yeah, there's a ton
And
of
that,
them.
yeah, it's now I think 50 or something, with a few kind of other things like Invigorated, or uh, I know Shambler had some custom stuff until I overhauled them completely. So it was a kind of a small idea where I just did some initial boosts, uh, but it was good. It was a lot of good content, but it was poorly balanced because I hand balanced it all, which later I would completely delete. And that's not a joke. I actually completely deleted my monster folder for PVD 5.0, and started fresh. So there's been a lot of fun stuff that has happened during the development of it.
I also found it pretty noteworthy for the character rebalance, just because it did also make that it set aside like veteran characters and the master characters a lot more from each other. It is very interesting for increasing that sense of reward, and that was really neat because it's like I always like that in advancement where something significant occurs in a character advancement. So it's not like a oh, yay, very threadbare thing. Like some of the increases in Darkest Dungeon that I generally found the most significant for characters that you're gonna look at was like everyone who had marked target damage, because that shit just escalates like a lot. So because I like picked through a bunch of the stat files for PVD, and there was some interesting stuff in there, including potions.
Yeah, I mean, what you say about stats is true. It seems that players generally dislike kind of these bare stat upgrades. It- you just mentioned Skyrim, just because
Lovi's
Leon's
playing
playing
that
it
in
at
the
the moment.
background.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you have things in the vanilla stat tree like, plus 10% damage with bows or something. And it's boring. It's easy. I get why designers do it, but it's a bit boring. Um, the kind of these big changes to how a skill or how a class works are hard to design for. Very difficult. And I would say that it's never going to be something that you can do quickly or easily and hope to balance properly. But it's
'Cause then
worth it
games
because
break.
people, if you have this branching skill tree where you have to choose, between your arrows doing something mechanically different, game-changingly different, that's a pretty difficult choice. And I think it rewards specific play styles. It rewards that difficult choice. And I think PvD has always been about rewarding, or at least attempted to reward, difficult choice in a way that I personally feel that the vanilla game does not do.
It does actually really complement using a lot of different character groupings. It like opens up a bunch of different ones, which I found really neat.
It originally did, I would say. One of the biggest complaints there were a ton of very good complaints about PVD 5.0.
He's at like 8 point something now, isn't it? Or
It's on major version 6.0 right now.
There we go. Yeah, no, I knew it was past 5.0
Yeah.
because it's at like the one that has a trailer.
Yeah, that trailer was. Ugh. That was fun to me. So 5.0 had really poor character balance. It wasn't hand balanced anymore. With 5.0, that was when I deleted my entire enemy folder and just started fresh with everything concerning enemies. Took a lot of time, but it was worth it. It was absolutely worth it. And what ended up happening is that heroes were pretty imbalanced, and there were only like 4 usable heroes at champ. Like everything needed a man at arms in champ. It was really bad. So that was one of the major focuses of 6.0 was to entirely rebalance heroes from the ground up to make them all generally usable at all tiers.
Huh. Fair enough. So, how have these changes and work practices evolved over the course of Pitch Black's multiple iterations, and did working more directly with Red Hook influence some of these design changes and your own sort of work decisions?
Absolutely, absolutely. Working with them completely changed how I approached PVD. And completely changed it. I was a lot more careful with documentation. I was very careful with revisioning. So having backups of different versions of my files. It was pretty much night and day difference between how I approach things after working with Red Hook. I started working with Red Hook around PVD 4.6, I believe. So everything past that was utilize the knowledge that I had, obtained from that point onwards, and it was incredibly useful. Now the changes that occurred within PVD, it's really vast. I mean, there's probably, I think, over 75 pages of change log with PVD. So there have been not only 2.0s of systems, but 3.0s of a lot of systems too. And I've never been afraid of completely overhauling something if it meant that it would improve. In fact, I quite enjoy it. So when I originally, for instance, added Twisted Remains, which was the Twisted Dungeon implementation into PVD permanently, I eventually went back and revisited mini bosses multiple times and overhauled dungeon generation once again, and just every system has undergone multiple iterations to create the PVD that you see.
So, now a lot of what we've so far focused on is very mechanics oriented. As PVD evolved, there's also a narrative focus there, where you specifically went to incorporate its own unique narrative within Darkest Dungeon's existing world. So how tricky was that?
It was quite tricky. I used to write narrative poetry. I really enjoy telling stories. Never much like poetry as a kid. But I always gravitated towards narrative poems, so stuff like The Raven, which is my favorite. And a lot of Lovecraft's poetic works were narrative poems. So moving on to kind of creating this story told in paragraph style. You find journal pages and you have to get information into that. It was definitely a unique challenge, and I did not anticipate that it would turn out to be as large as it has now become. I don't remember what sparked the idea to tell a unique story in the mod. I just remember that the lore pages came out with 5.0, and it was with 5.1, Jester's Tale, that I released the first 100 or so journal pages. That was kind of the main focus of that update, was the release of the new lore. And I kind of started off telling this vague story of a man who had his wife kidnapped, and he had some things in the past that he regretted, and we had this vague outline of who he was, and it was more about his telling of the world. That was the main focus of 5.1 was not his story, but rather his telling of the different enemies that you would find in the environment. I wanted to expand in a immersive and canon, or as canon as fan fiction can be, I guess, a way of I wanted to expand upon the vanilla lore that I thought was there. Sorry, that I thought was there, but it was kind of it was a little lacking in the way of telling you what these creatures did or their different attacks. It was left up to the imagination. I think that's okay, but I think there's a fine balance between too vague and left up to the imagination.
I mean, by comparison, you said like the first update had a release of around 100 journal pages, and for Darkest Dungeon and I believe with the Shield Breaker, there comes out to be a total of like 29 journal pages, I think.
That sounds about right.
Yeah. So there's a lot more room there, I think, to tell a story, because going through the journal pages, there's references to creatures and the like, but it's a narrower frame, and certain ones get highlighted a lot more. If anything, actually, I'd say the biggest thing that gets highlighted and hinted at is the Shambler and how to summon it, and sort of what to expect from it even. Because there's like 2 stories that have the Shambler sort of appear in it and let you know that it's going to kill your face horribly.
In the vanilla lore?
Mm-hmm. 2 of the stories have the Shambler show up.
So the vanilla lore was written by backers. I think Red Hook only wrote the Shieldbreaker pages and the secret thank you note in the final Darkest Dungeon quest.
I haven't gotten that note yet because I keep dying.
It's difficult. That was one of the man. I remember working on that. I worked with them on that. That was incredibly fun to see the Darkest Dungeon area come together. I did the AI work for the enemies in there. It was pretty fun.
Wow, so I have you to blame for that.
In some ways, yeah. In some ways, I've had a little bit of an impact on the balance. In some ways good, in some ways bad. So it's a learning process. So the lore, I feel, is a missed opportunity with Red Hook. I think that there's a lot of opportunity to be made, and I think PVD is a good example of the opportunity that can be had with the lore. I think PVD adds just enough, if not maybe too many pieces. But I enjoy the fact that the original 100 pages were good, but they were also really bad. I like what I did with them, I just don't like how they're told. They're a little too simplistic. A lot of my writing style was still, it's still, kind of maturing. I don't think any 24-year-old writer should ever call themselves a professional, or it's an art, So it was being perfected, and it was just too amateur. But I really liked that people latched on to the story of the Maester, which, looking back, I should never have ever called him in relation to my pseudonym online. But people really latched onto that, and I enjoyed that. I enjoyed writing about this fictional character who had come to the hamlet for some vague reason, and I expanded upon that. And the characters that I mentioned, kind of in that original lore, I also expanded on. So I had Lillian, and then I had the Plague Doctor Emery, and I gave them each backstories and reasons why they knew this main character. And then I added lore about Agnes and why she was taken, and the deception of the cult leader by the ancestor, and it just kind of expanded into this full story with its own main quest at the end. So it was pretty neat just to actually create kind of a underlying story on top of the main story, or I would say running parallel with the main story.
So, we've talked a bit about like the mechanics and the story of it. What was the hardest challenge when making the mod?
That's difficult. There were a lot of, I mean, there's countless number of problems and challenges that I had to face. I'm not sure if I can pick out any specific.
Pick your top few.
Man, there were so many. I mean, there were difficult parts. Like for instance, with 5.0, it was the patch to support the full release version of the game, and I had just ended up working like, I don't know, it was like probably 80 to 90 hours a week on the final release of the game. And immediately after that, with like no break, I had to then, once it was released, develop PVD 5.0. So it was like official work and then unofficial work right after one another. And then I made PVD 5.0 in 3 months. And the difficulty, I would say, for that, I remember just like shedding multiple tears as I pressed the delete button on the entire monster folder, and knowing that I was in for a huge amount of work to recreate every affix from the ground up. I would say 6.0 was probably the most difficult because that took me about 9 months to create. That was pretty much a reimagining of the mod, not just, the enemy folder, but everything from the ground up. And the creation of my trailer and kind of the final version, the version to rule all versions. I didn't want to have to create a 7.0. I was getting pretty done with modding and trying to look at other opportunities at that time. But there's just so many difficulties. There were, bugs that made me so frustrated that I did break down because there's no way to know what's causing the crash sometimes. There was one that I know some of my older players will remember. There was a file size, or there was a file number limitation. So there were a certain number of files that could be loaded by the engine. And there's no way to know that this was a limitation. It's just you would be playing PVD and it would crash. And there was no way to know why. You would get rid of like the scenario that caused the crash, and it would just happen somewhere else. And it was because too many files were being loaded, so PVD was too large. And it was so frustrating because you would delete so much that had previously not caused any crash and had not changed, but it would just still cause crashes. And that was so frustrating. And it was only after contacting the programmer here about it that he found out the reason for it. So there have been some pretty frustrating challenges to deal with when making PVD.
So PVD for its engine, like, did you figure out how to work with it yourself? I'm not actually familiar if it's a custom engine or if it's one of the.
It's a proprietary engine that I believe Care had worked on for many years prior to joining with Chris and Tyler. If that's wrong, I apologize. I don't remember for sure the whole story on that.
But that means
it's
that all the issues you're going to be coming across are fresh, new, and exciting to you, and not something you can really pick over someone else's brain other than the creators then.
Yeah, there's no way to Google the issue, and no modder had access to the source code. So it was just kind of, if a crash was happening, and they didn't have mod support this time either. So I was working with Red Hook, but I wasn't, I didn't feel right, and I don't think I was supposed to ask for help with any modding issues. So I didn't. This was the only time that I ever said, hey, this is like an issue, and I cannot, for the life of me, track it. It was extremely debilitating for my modding. So it was kind of this is my last try. If Care can't help me, if he's too busy, which I would understand, then I have no idea what to do.
Fair enough. So, were there difficulties narrative-wise in setting up the story?
I would say, so George Martin, the author of Game of Thrones, he's, and I'm going to paraphrase him, but what he said was, there are two types of writers. There are gardeners and architects. Gardeners plant a seed and let it grow how it does, and architects create the blueprints for a story and then build it around that blueprint. And I took the route that George Martin himself takes, where he kind of plants a seed and lets it grow. If you ever look at his original plan for Game of Thrones, it's completely different from how it's turned out now. I think he had like Jaime Lannister ending up taking the throne and whatnot. So it's pretty crazy. I never planned for PVD's story to evolve into what it is now. But I just kind of planted these initial seeds of characters and vague plots of the Maester killing his father and having his wife kidnapped. And I kind of just allowed these vague ideas to seed the stories of other updates. So after 5.1, I had kind of my own self-proclaimed promise to create at least 10 new lore pages with every update. And I use those at least 10 new lore pages to add on to the story. So every update there was some new path or new development for the story to look forward to as well. And I really like how that turned out. And I really like the post 5.1 lore pages. I think that they're some of my favorite. I think 6.0's lore pages were probably my favorite, though.
So there was some nice episodic story updates that were done better than the whole Half-Life episodes.
I mean, it's up to people to determine if my lore is good. I tried to make it canon.
Well, I just meant for consistency.
I think in some ways.
I'm still waiting for episode 3.
Well, you and the entire internet.
Yeah. So by the time it rolled around to 6.1 something, how many lore pages are there in total?
I think there's over 220 now.
Cripes.
Well, so 6.0 added a lot. I think it added probably, I don't know, it was 35 or 40. The reason it did that is because there were a lot of people struggling with curios in PVD. PVD's curio interactions were always difficult to convey. You can't change curios and not have people use a sort of wiki or a guide. Because at that point in the game, this was before, the hints or, the item interaction hints that they have now. There's just no good way to change curios and somehow convey them in game. But I tried. So what I did was I created lore pages that from the Plague Doctor Emery and a few from the Maester himself that it immersively told characters about curio interactions. So there was just a small kind of contained story about, like putting a knife into the knot in a tree to scrape loot that somebody had stashed there. So I really enjoyed that. I think other people enjoyed that too. That was a good idea. It was a way to, for people to obtain something from reading lore. Which if you've read one of my recent blog posts was about how to, what people enjoyed about in-game lore and how to deliver it in a way that people enjoyed. And I think with PVD's lore, I learned that people enjoy short bursts of lore that's useful. Some people enjoy the story, but some people just grab the lore and, take it back for gold, or they just get rid of it. And, it's fine. But I think if you provide interesting information or useful information in that lore, then people are more likely to read it.
So, with all this said on the various features and the challenges, is there anything that didn't make it into the mod that you really wanted?
Oh, yeah. There's a ton of stuff that I had prototyped and didn't work or because of engine limitations. I would say there was one thing that I think with enough, well, there were a couple things. There was one big thing, one small thing that I think with enough work and if there were no engine limitations in place, that they would have been quite interesting to mess around with. The first one and the biggest one was that I initially wanted mini bosses to drop these custom heirlooms that were metal ore and metal ingots, and you could use those to upgrade your weapons and armor. So you pretty much were forced to fight mini bosses to obtain weapon and armor upgrades. And it was pretty interesting. I had everything implemented and created, and it was only once I implemented it and tested it that I found that it crashed at the end of the quest when you obtained these heirlooms, and only because the game was hard coded to support the 4 heirlooms that are existing in the base game. So I think with enough testing and work, it might have been a pretty interesting idea to follow. But I had to scrap it because of the crashes.
Okay. Is there anything you feel like went really well? Like concept-wise, something mechanically or the like that was just spot on, encapsulated everything you've been going out for with the mod?
I would say that there's systems in PVD that I really like. There's some that I really like and some that I really regret adding, at least in the way that I added them. One of the things that I like is the way that I reward risk. And I would say that the collector is one good example of that. So you can randomly encounter, in PVD you don't encounter the collector himself randomly, you encounter his heads. And his heads will drop a random assortment of shards of varying vibrancy and size. So depending on the vibrancy and size of the shard that you use with the curio to summon the collector, it summons a more difficult one, but it also gives you a higher chance of obtaining one of the 15 head trinkets. And I would say that's a very good example of PVD's goal for rewarding risk. And that I've always enjoyed player choice influencing the difficulty of a game rather than pure numbers. So I've been very outspoken against the original New Game Plus and the Stygian difficulty of time limits and death limits, and a vague increase to enemy crit health. And I know actually one of my upcoming blog posts is going to be focusing very heavily on difficulty design. And Skyrim is another instance where I find that this kind of just simple boost to enemy health is a really simple and lazy way to increase difficulty. In some ways it's important, and I wouldn't discount stat increases, but if you just do stat increases alone, it's just really boring and enemies get tanky and it's kind of artificial.
Yeah, no, I get that. Like, one of my favorite games for difficulty increases was the Devil May Cry system for how much it changed enemy behavior and what they had access to.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think AI, I remember talking about this recently, but I can't remember where. Actually, it might have been in the developer lounge here, where Doom's difficulty, as you went up in difficulty, the new Doom, it kept enemies about the same, and your damage about the same, but it increased enemy damage to you, and added new AI options, and made them, more aware, and made them more just
Aggressive, tricky, accurate.
Yes, absolutely, exactly. So, I think that it's much better and more rewarding to a skilled player of a game. So, for in this instance, an FPS game, to have difficulty levels make it so that they're not spending, 1 billion ammo to down an enemy, but rather it makes themselves more vulnerable as the enemies, and it makes the enemies as smart or smarter as the player. So I've definitely disliked how Darkest Dungeon approaches difficulty in that regard, and one of PVD's focuses was to create, as best as I could, systems where it rewarded player risk, and it offered player choice, both in the hamlet and in dungeon when you were in combat, so that simple mistakes could cost you a lot, but that it never felt unfair. And it's the reason that I never increased crit chance, for instance, on enemies, despite numerous confirmation bias claims that I have. So it was always meant to be fair and winnable.
Yeah, I'll say, like, that's one of the things that frustrated me the most in going through the Crimson Courtyard, would be like one of the bosses just whipping out like 4 turns in a row and me being like, okay, that hurt. Because it also
turns has been difficult. It was difficult to design for. I mean, I've done some of that on my own, increasing the initiatives per round of enemies, and giving bosses multiple initiatives is a very useful tool. But it's very risky, especially when you decide what to do with those initiatives. If you just give, like the Shrieker, for instance, has like 3 attacks, and he has 4 initiatives per round. And his 3 attacks are stress, and massive damage. And it's pretty boring when it's just a random kind of pick from those skills for 4 times each round. It's like, okay, I get it, you're not really meant to kill him, but it's just kind of boring. So with a lot of my boss overhauls, I've either kept the same amount of initiatives or added initiatives, but I've also heavily adjusted the AI to do different things with those initiatives. But it's definitely, I definitely sympathize with people who kind of dislike here the enemy's going to go 4 times this round, and
I mean, on
Every
one
attack.
hand, it made characters that do status debuffs essentially do a metric shit ton of damage, because you end up, like, on a Plague Doctor, it means your average damage is somewhere like 20 with maxed out Blight, because they're going to get every single tick
yeah,
piling
yeah,
on them.
absolutely. I know Tyler and I talked about it a bit, that these multiple initiatives kind of buff dots and DOT heroes, but at the same time, they're
Completely nerf
debuffing and
and marking,
Mars. So
which
there's definitely pros and cons to it.
Yeah, it means that certain classes get entirely shafted for mechanics that are core to them, and other ones flourish a lot more. And it's sort of a shame in that regards that, like, there's certain classes that do get shafted pretty hard for the Crimson Court DLC, at least for their viability in, like, the main Crimson Court area. At least in the boss fights. In the normal fights, they're pretty A-okay.
I would say 2 of PvD's main focuses were drawing out the length of combat and making the core gameplay loop more interesting. And I needed to do this because I wanted to make non-combat skills, utility skills, debuffing skills, I wanted to make them more useful. And you can't do that when your combats only last, 1 to 2 rounds each, which is a pretty common thing in vanilla. Debuffing just isn't useful outside of some boss fights because it's easier just to do damage, and that's that. So with the combination of which I have done it increase, enemy health significantly, although I've increased hero damage significantly as well. But just increasing the health, adding affixes, increasing enemy damage in various forms. So like through skills or through AI changes, just making them more deadly. It kind of makes you want to do self buffs or do debuffs. Fights are usually going to last probably, I would say, 3 to 4 rounds in PvD or even longer. So it opens up the ability to do these debuffs. And I've added a lot more, as you've probably seen with some of the skills. So like, I know I've done a lot of crit debuff skills. So there's a lot of new options in PvD. Some that I think are used and some that I think not, but they're there for people who like different playstyles.
So, with all this said, and it being your baby, do you have, like, a favorite memory of watching someone go through PVD?
I've seen a lot of gameplay of it. It was very useful. I would usually work on it on one screen and watch somebody play it on the other. I never had much time for testing it myself outside of smoke testing for bugs and initial errors, just to make sure that I wasn't going to completely break the game upon implementation. So I needed other people to play beta versions and to play the current version, that I could find bugs and fix them. It's useful in a way, but I do regret that I couldn't play it as much. I always needed to work on it rather than play it. If I spent half my time working and half my time playing, then it would have taken another 4.5 months to create PVD 6.0, and it would have taken over a year total to create 6.0. So I really enjoy watching it, and my favorite moments are when people win. PVD was always designed to be beatable. And I guess my audience changed quite a bit over the course of development. Originally, PVD was meant to be a difficulty mod. but it eventually became an overhaul mod that I guess was balanced more around the norm rather than the veteran player. So that's been something that I've contended with. I should have mentioned that for one of the challenges that I faced. Forget all the good ones when I'm in the moment. So, as I said, it was originally balanced for the veteran, but it kind of started to balance around the normal player, the average player.
Okay.
And definitely my favorite moments are watching people beat it. Watching them go through these new Darkest Dungeon quests and find the lore. Watching them see the story come together and finally beat something that usually takes people about 100, 150 weeks to beat.
Nice. So, with all of that actually attended to, is there anything you have planned for when the Color of Madness hits?
Not personally. I've kind of retired from modding, but I have a really dedicated fan base, and which extremely grateful. Never expected for that ever to happen. And I know that I think some of them would be willing to help create the Color of Madness patch. And sometimes they ask me for some help with balancing. I'm always glad to help them kind of understand some of the ideas behind what made kind of the core design pillars of PVD, so that they can create even better patches than I've created myself. So I'm sure someone will pick it up just like they did with Crimson Court.
All right. So, are there any game dev related projects you have planned or in the process of then?
Absolutely. I think I'm one of those people, it's not to toot my own horn, but I always have ideas. Sometimes they don't work out, but I always have them, and I've got a couple of projects that I'm working on over the summer. One that I'm hoping will reach demo status before the end of the month here. More to share on that soon, though. So, yeah, I'm definitely working on some stuff on my own, and I'm looking for employment at the same time. If you know anybody who needs a designer, I'll definitely be willing to talk to them.
Okay, so in that regards, then, if we're going to be hush hush about what delightful indie projects you have cooking in the oven.
I've had a great difficulty finding an artist to partner up with. I don't know if I'm just looking in the wrong places or what, but without an artist, I'm pretty limited in my abilities, because you don't want me making art. That's the last thing you want me doing in life, is creating art.
It'll probably still look better than my stuff. I make really squiggly stick figures.
I don't know. My stick figures might be worse. It's not great. I've never had an artistic ability. I have a good idea of what it should look like in my mind. I'm a Picasso, but in reality, I am like a child with a box of crayons.
In my mind's eye, I sort of want like the thumbnail of this video to be like a stick figure from both of us, but I feel like that would be very counterintuitive to anyone ever clicking this.
They wouldn't know the context of it until they heard this.
And then they'd be like, "Oh, that's why you guys blinded me."
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks.
So without an artist, I'm pretty limited in what I'm able to do. But I've been expanding. I've been using Unreal Engine 4 since its release in 2015 or 2014. Whenever it came out, people have Google, they can look it up. So I've been kind of creating my own prototypes and projects, and one of the things I've been creating is kind of an ARG type puzzle game because it requires not really any artwork. I like puzzles, like Easter eggs that require a lot of thinking to solve. So it's something that it challenges me, but that I am still able to do, which is definitely a recommendation to any future current developers trying to get their projects off the ground.
I mean, that does actually help rather well, because I was going to ask you, like, is there anything you want to share with the audience, or words you may have for devs?
Yes.
Yeah.
This is such a competitive, stressful industry. I would say that the one thing you can't do if you want to succeed is give up. I mean, that goes with anything. But in this industry, it's, you're one out of 1,000 sometimes competing for a job. You should expect a no, but it should never stop you from trying. And because games are so difficult to create, and then it's easy to say games are easy to create when you see some of the amateur stuff coming out on Steam and other platforms and whatnot.
Except that also works counterintuitively then, because there's stuff that's low effort being churned out, but there's so many there that it literally strangles other titles.
Yes. So, if you're trying to create something, I would just be happy with what you can create with your current skills, but never to stop challenging yourself. If you're working on a new project and you're thinking, okay, this isn't challenging me, it's easy, I can just do it, then you're not going to create your best because you're not pushing the envelope of what you're able to do. But at the same time, if you challenge yourself too hard, which I think is something I've seen a lot as a designer, is these younger kids who want to get into development, and they say, "Oh, I'm going to make the next open world RPG. It's going to be awesome. I have this entire custom pantheon of gods laid out, and it's all these quests I have, written down in a Word document." It's like, this game is never going to be made. Hate to bust your balls with this, but it's never going to be made because you have no skills to do this. You need to obtain the skills, and you need to obtain a team that is willing to undertake the years of development that this would require before even attempting this. So it's cool, but sideline it. Sideline it for now, and find something that right now is possible but challenges you. That you can look at and say, okay, I've got a little skill with making some levels in Unreal Engine. I've done some tutorials and whatnot, but I've never worked with the UI. So create something that has some level design, some stuff that you've already done, and then add on top of that an element of something that you haven't done. So, create a simple UI, create a simple score counter or, a health bar. Just always be trying to do something you've never done before, and you will continue to grow at a pretty rapid pace.
So, first off, the great bit of advice there is appreciated. Secondly, are there any indie projects that you'd like to share with the audience, just of stuff you're following in the community?
Oh man, I mean, people always bash early access on Steam.
There's good and bad there. There's Dead Cells.
There are some bad there.
So
there's, good. There's a lot of stuff that's just kind of, but there's also been some amazing games that have come from early access. What are some?
Dead Cells.
Dead Cells, Starbound. There's Book of Demons, which I think just launched. Or no, that's still in early access, but that's
getting close to launch, I believe.
I think so, yeah. I know know there are others too.
I sort of followed them as a studio because it looked like they were going to be doing a few unique spins on other games too.
I think they have like 7 games planned.
Yeah, and they're all going to
that
be.
are all within the same universe or something.
Okay, so Book of Demons looked to be sort of a fresh take on like Diablo. It is very much meant as an homage to that.
I think people see like the cards and they think it's like some card game, but it's really not. Like it's definitely like a Diablo hack and slash,
Yeah,
but it's
and there's
combined with-
references I felt to it in the way it was built in the class presentation, a number of things there. So I was sort of interested because I think that was part of their like thing is they're like taking these games that are from like their childhood and sort of reinventing them.
It felt like a combination of, in some ways, Darkest Dungeon and Diablo. Like as Darkest Dungeon, I guess I can call myself a pretty avid fan of Darkest Dungeon. It felt really familiar, and I love ARPGs as well. So you kind of, if you're a fan of ARPGs, then it's gonna be easy to pick up, and it's really well made. It runs well. It's got some really cool ideas. It's made really well, and it's one of those games that if you stay away from early access, you're gonna be missing out on a really great title. And there's so many that are like that. I think all of Amplitude Studios, so the developers that make the Endless games, even Endless Legend, Dungeon of the Endless, all of those games started out as early access.
I
know,
cannot say enough good about Endless Dungeon.
I love that game just because of its uniqueness.
I like playing it with friends and then dying horribly.
Yeah, exactly. I really like Endless Space as well. I really have a soft spot for Endless Legend.
Haven't played that yet. I've been told I should. In the same breath as my friend telling me how unbalanced the races he plays and how he's going to mind control all my people into being his.
How he's
I wouldn't say they're imbalanced, but they're so unique. Like when you play something like Civ, it's like every race is pretty much the same, like except for like one little stat bonus, right? Like,
Yeah.
you might find a little bit more resources, or you might have a different boost to a unit. Great, it's nothing really different. But with Endless Legend, what I appreciate is the fact that the races are so different. We have the roving clan who builds their cities on top of these giant beetles, and at any time they can pick up their city and move it. I mean, that's crazy. So you have a faction that doesn't use food, so they survive off of the currency dust, and it's these really crazy differences in the way that the factions play that change the game entirely. And it feels like an RPG as well when you're playing. So, you can create custom units with, items that you may have obtained in a quest, or, different resources that you may have acquired. You can kit out your heroes with skills. It feels like a really fresh take. It doesn't always succeed, but it's so fresh from a Civ, from the Civ like 4X formula, that I have never really wanted to return to Civ after playing.
Fair enough. Yeah, I played a Civ game a long time ago and was like, I don't have enough days in my week to see this game done.
Yeah. I played it. It's like I see so many people playing it. I watch some content creators that really enjoy playing it too, but it just always seems so samey. Like everything you do in the course of a game is the same as you did in the last game, even if you choose a different faction. there's a lot of repetition, and the gameplay loop is largely the same. So I think I really enjoy the fresh takes that Amplitude Studios takes with 4X formula to try and make it so that, the simple terrain generation can make it impossible for you to attack another city, or how facing a different faction and change the way that you approach your entire setup for your own faction.
Yeah. Overall, yeah, there's a lot of things I'm super hopeful for. I'll admit I'm actually part of the camp that's a little hesitant towards early access because I've been bitten by it too, but I will be amongst the first two to say there's great titles there and some really great developers who listen to the people who are investing the early access to like improve their game with them. So yeah.
Yeah, there's definitely been some, sometimes where you get bitten after the fact. There are some games that are in early access too that
It's never gonna leave it. Onikira.
Yeah, for a long time, people thought Starbound wouldn't leave. I mean, I don't know the exact story behind that. I heard that they had some internal development issues for like a year, but they picked it up well and they released it. So I'm glad that they didn't fall into that pit. But there are other games that just probably shouldn't be there, but they are, because they're too good. I think like Factorio. Which Factorio existed for like 2 to 3 years before it came onto Steam, and that was always good. Or Oxygen Not Included, from Clay Entertainment.
Yeah.
I mean, we know that they make fantastic games. Like, I don't feel like I'm gonna be bitten in the ass purchasing a Clay Entertainment game.
Admittedly,
to me,
I follow their stuff quite a bit.
I went to GDC last year and met the guy who created Hot Lava, the newer game that they're going to be releasing. I don't know if you've heard of that one.
I checked a bunch of their recent stuff, and I believe it was, what is it? Unlimited Invisible Ink. That was like the last thing of theirs that really resonated with me.
I like that game. That was good. I enjoyed that.
That and Mark of the Ninja.
Indeed. I think Hot Lava is like, I can explain it. If you know the game as a kid that you played, that's the game that they're making. So it's kind of it's just a platformer that's meant for the speed. I wouldn't say it's really meant for, but it caters to the speedrun community. But it's fun as well to people who don't speedrun. There's people who like
So
the
like Heck
silliness
Truck.
of platforming over
Or
mundane
sorry,
areas that are filled with lava.
Cluster Truck. Heck Truck. What the?
Indeed.
Yeah. It's sort of like the Cluster Truck vibe. It definitely appeals to speedrunners, but it also just appeals to people who enjoy that sort of chaotic mess.
Yeah, this like the demo level is just, it's a school with things in normal place except the floor is of course hot lava, because that's the entire premise of the childhood game. So it's really fun to platform, to beat your times. And after talking to them at GDC last year, they have a ton of game modes planned, like reversing the course, or I know there are others are like racing your friends and stuff. So there's a lot planned for it that is really interesting. So I really like their games. Yeah, I think that's coming out into beta soon, closed beta soon.
Yeah, I think so.
I know I signed up for it immediately. Really, really nice two people that I met though from entertainment. I think it him and his wife, they're both artists at clay. And it was his idea originally that he was working on himself and pitched to the upper management, and they agreed to work on it as a team, which was really cool.
But with all this said, is there anything else that you'd sort of like to address as your final words, I guess, for this interviewee podcasty bit?
Man, I don't know if there's anything else I'd like to say that I haven't already said. I guess I would. I mean, this wouldn't be possible without. I mean, it sounds cheesy to say, but it wouldn't be possible without the fans and without Red Hook. I was very scary not going to college and trying to convince my parents that I was doing the right thing. So it was either very lucky, or I'm doing something. God forbid I'm doing something right in this industry to warrant the small-time success that I've earned.
So, with that said then, you folks in the audience can check out the Pitch Black mod in the community workshop for Darkest Dungeon on Steam. There's also a fantastic Discord community that you can join, with links to both being in the description. And is there anywhere else you'd actually care to send people?
No, those are two good places. We have a great Discord community of, I think, over 2,700 people now, and
Chock full of memes. Chock full of memes.
Well, when there's no Color of Madness news, it's just a lot of memes and off-topic talk.
The dankest of dungeons.
Exactly.
But for you folks who enjoyed this interview, you can comment, and I will probably actually get back to you. And a like to this video is always appreciated. Otherwise, if you'd like to see more quality content like this, feel free to click the subscribe button and the little bell so you actually get notified when I interview other peeps. In the meantime, I'd really like to actually thank you, Joey, for actually showing up on the show, because, like, I get you have your projects you're busy on, so it's actually super appreciated that you popped
really
on.
wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Also, plus I got all that backstory about, like, Pitch Black and just more insight into, like, Darkest Dungeon and Red Hook, so it's feel good for me, because I backed Darkest Dungeon. I was enamored with the game from the start.
I never expected that I would find that project on Kickstarter and end up working on it in the future. That was something I never ever expected.
High five, since we've both done that for different projects.
Yeah, it's an experience. It definitely is.
But yeah, overall, just thank you, and thanks for putting up with my dumb questions, sporadic as they may be, on your community. To the viewers,
it was fantastic.
Thanks for watching this show. Stay tuned. We'll catch you next week with some more quality content. In the meantime, see you next time.